Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for joining us at the LSE for this evening's event, which is hosted by the LSE's Department of Economics and the journal Economica. Warm welcome to the audience here in the theater, but also to the many who are joining us online. My name is Francesco Caselli. I am the Norman Sosno Professor of Economics, and I am the head of the Department of Economics here at the LSE. And as such, I am ex officio the chair of the board of Economica, which is the LSE's international peer-reviewed economics journal with a very storied history and that recently celebrated its 100th anniversary. This evening, we are very pleased to welcome Professor Claudia Goldin to the LSE to deliver her lecture, Why Women Won. How, when, and why did women in the US obtain legal rights equal to men's regarding workplace, marriage, family, social security, criminal justice, credit markets, and other parts of the economy and society? These are the questions that Professor Goldin will be answering tonight. Professor Goldin is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics and holds the Lee and Espelita Professorship of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. She's been the director of the MBR's Development of the American Economy program from 1989 to 2017, and is the co-director of the MBR's Gender in the Economy group. Her latest book is Career and Family, Women's Century-Long Journey Towards Equity, which I believe are available outside for purchase, I think, and has been translated into 15 languages. And, of course, last but not least, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for having advanced our understanding of women's labor market outcomes. And so we are very, very pleased to have her with us tonight. Twitter use. Twitter users, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE-Coase. The event is being recorded, and we hope to make it available as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. That's something that only at the LSE we feel that we have to say. As usual, there will be the chance for you to put your questions to the speaker here in the theater, but also online audience can submit questions via the Q&A feature at the top left of the screen. And please remember to include your name and affiliation. And for now, I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Goldin to present her lecture on Why Women Won.
So thanks very much. When I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, I went to study industrial organization. And in my second year, in preparation for the field exam in I.O., I took a course called Business 382. It's called Trade Regulation and the Control of Monopolies. And it was taught by, yes, Ronald Coase. It was taught at the downtown University of Chicago Business School. Coase was a great lecturer, fantastic. And he had an absolutely droll, dry sense of humor, often lost on the MBAs in the room. I searched my notes for examples of his wit, but I was much too good a student to have taken all that down. So I recently listened to Ronald Coase giving the Coase lecture on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the University of Chicago's law school. He, by the way, was 92 at the time. Coase began his talk by noting, he said, It's strange experience, he said, for me to be giving a Coase lecture. He said, after all my lectures are Coase lectures. Well, this is my first Coase lecture, and I'm deeply honored. So my presentation is about women's rights in the United States after suffrage. When did women's rights change in the US? How did they change? Why did they change? Why women won rights initially and ironically had much to do with the US civil rights movement. The women's rights movement awakened a large group of women and men to a set of wrongs. And in an extraordinarily brief time frame, you'll see, considerable legislation was passed and various judicial decisions bolstered these laws. But the passage of some legislation reinvigorated an anti-feminist, traditionalist movement, mainly of women, that is with us today. I will end by showing the deep divisions that have existed in the US between traditionalists, who are women, and feminists, who are women. By women's rights, I will always mean that the legal, political, and social rights of women are absolutely equal to those of men. I will include legal rights in the polity, in the workplace, in school and family, marriage, credit, Social Security, and the military, as well as with regards to a woman's own body. I will talk mainly about the expansion of rights. It's been a challenge to identify the impact of workplace rights on women's earnings and their educational attainment. There are a number of very clever explorations listed here, for example, regarding women's sports. I will first tell the fascinating history of when women won, and then I'll discuss how women won. Civil rights and women's rights have long been intertwined and were often at odds, in fact, most of the history. In 1964, however, civil rights and women's rights came together, and a national women's rights movement emerged soon after. In the late 1960s, an overwhelming majority of Americans, we'll see, thought women could be employed even if their husbands could support them, and that women should be more politically active. And even, as you'll see, that a woman could actually become president. But it took a far longer time for a majority of Americans to agree that women could be employed if they had preschool children, and that women should have an equal role in business and government. But very rapidly, by the mid-1970s, after considerable legislation on women's rights had been passed, women were deeply divided by education, employment, family status, and geography on whether they supported the women's movement. Men, however, were not divided in the same manner. When women read, this is very, it came back. Okay, one has to believe. This is something having to do with the connection here. It is not my computer that's doing this. Okay, but I will continue. Okay. When women read the title of my paper, they remark, "Really? We won?" Okay, at some point we may have to call my friend Zach. I've gotten to know him. He's the tech person. Okay, I will finish this and then we'll see whether we want to go to their other computer, which is not a Mac, and therefore will not have the right symbols, okay? Okay. I don't know why non-Americans eschew Macs. Okay, so when women read the title of my paper, they remark, really? We won? But not that long ago, women were, in fact, fired or demoted for being married, getting married, being pregnant, having children, or even capable of having children. There's an important Supreme Court case about that. They were denied credit and mortgages. They had to use their husband's name on credit cards and on their driver's license. They were treated differently than identical men by the IRS, the Social Security system, the retirement rules of the federal government, and the military. They had jobs that were advertised separately from those of men, although blacks and whites at the time, that could not be done for that. They had restrictions on their work hours, types of jobs, conditions of jobs. They were harassed sexually as if that was normal. That's also a Supreme Court case. They were not seated on juries or had to opt in or were routinely exempted. Consider the fact that no one questioned when this book was written and the movie came out why there were 12 angry men. Consider as well the Supreme Court decision in a case that I don't think any of you know, called Hoyt versus Florida in 1961, in which a wife was found guilty of killing her abusive husband. The most liberal of all Supreme Courts in the United States, the Warren Court, the court that gave us Brown, Miranda, Griswold, and Loving, that court determined unanimously, 9-0, that because women were, and I quote, the center of the home and family life, they could be excused from jury duty. And they were excused. They were not seated for her jury. Although that was not the case, as I said, for blacks. Yet from the 1960s to the 1970s, the rights listed here, you can still see it, became guaranteed through legislation and judicial decisions. Despite the glaring facts that women were not treated as the equals of men in courts of law, in banks, and schools, few thought women were discriminated against, even though they thought the same or may have thought the same about blacks. Consider this Google Ngram on the Ngram racial discrimination, giving an index of the counts of books in the Google American English corpus. They used the phrase at least once. As you can see, it spikes in 1948 with the desegregation of the armed forces by Truman, but it reaches its new plateau with the civil rights movement beginning around 1958. Now add the same for sex discrimination. As you can see, there is a 12-year lag, and sex discrimination, as an Ngram, takes off around 1970. And if you don't like Google Ngrams, we can do the same exercise using the corpus of major city newspapers in the US. And here the spike is a little different. The spike for race discrimination is with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And now add the same for sex discrimination, but make the scale comparable to that of Google Books. And you can see there is also about a 12-year lag, and it takes off around 1970, as it did with Google Books. I now turn to a chronology of the women's rights movement in the US, a somewhat involved chronology. So I will answer what was the road from an economy and society in which women were legally treated differently from men to one in which such treatment is illegal. Although I will not go through the period of suffrage, I need to start in 1908 with the famous case of Muller versus Oregon that began the legality of laws that protected women. These were championed, interestingly, by progressives. That's the picture of Louis Brandeis, who is the lawyer in the case, not on the Supreme Court at the time. And they were championed by these progressives to get a foot in the door for the union movement, which was quite feeble at the time in the US, to constrain employers through laws that would have been illegal under a famous decision called Lochner, decided in 1905, because these laws restricted the right of labor to contract freely, very important in the United States. Now, every state then passed protective legislation, every state, regarding hours, the weights that women could lift, the need that they had to have seats, even though they didn't have to sit in the seats, the occupations and jobs that they could have. But this would soon change. An important and influential commission on women's status was appointed by President Kennedy in 1961. It wasn't necessarily appointed because he wanted to help women directly. It was appointed because it was pretty clear in the 1960 election, in which he beat Nixon, it was clear that women had become a pivotal voting force, a pivotal constituency. The commission that he appointed called for the passage of the Equal Pay Act, but not the Equal Rights Act. It also called for the end of this thing called protective legislation, and it also called for the use of the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment to constrain states in the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment with the federal government. These amendments, although on the books for a very long time, had never been used to protect women, never been used on account of sex. And one of the reasons why Ruth Bader Ginsburg's book is on account of sex is because she was the lawyer who tried a case before the Supreme Court and got the 14th Amendment used on account of sex. But this is all very interesting, but I must digress for a short time because a lot happened in the 1960s. Interestingly, and unfortunately, a lot's happening similarly in the US today. A lot happened in the 1960s that I have to bring to bear on this. There was a civil rights movement, and there was the anti-war movement. And this picture that you see before you is actually of the March on the Pentagon, November of 1969. It is, to this day, the largest US demonstration ever, and I hope we don't see another one as large. And if you look really, really, really closely at the picture, okay, everyone looking closely at the picture, on the right-hand side of the reflecting pool, you're going to see me. So both of these movements, these important and large movements, gave women a lot. They gave them organizing talents. And in addition, they demonstrated to women that their issues, too, were not being discussed. Women learned that they, too, were oppressed. They learned the word oppression. And this led to both a national movement and a more local grassroots movement, the women's liberation movement. We can not return to it, and we can now return to the main timeline where things become a bit complicated, although I have no idea why there's a dinosaur there. And so here we move back to the complications in around 1963. The highly contentious Civil Rights Act was part of the Kennedy administration's agenda, very, very important, very, very pro-civil rights. But this had stalled in Congress. After Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes president. He is skilled at manipulating Congress and maneuvering around people in Congress. And LBJ manages to push this incredibly important legislation, which consisted of many different titles. And he managed to push it forward. And 2 days before the Civil Rights Act was voted on, 2 days, a word was added to something called Title VII. Title VII is what concerns private sector employment. And this had protected a group of individuals by race, ethnicity, but it did not include the word sex. The word was added by someone named Representative Howard Smith, pictured here, Democrat of Virginia, an ardent segregationist. Possibly to defeat it, it has been said, but I don't think so. I think history tells us that women in the House, the few that were there, had wanted to add the word. As Representative Martha Griffiths of Michigan noted, if Black women were to be protected at work, which is what this title would have done, white women should be as well, and the word stuck. LBJ supported adding the word, and the law passed in 1964. With Title VII, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, was established as the enforcing agency, but it took no action on account of sex. In fact, the commissioner even mocked the notion that he should, and he said, this is not a sex commission. That led to outrage, and it led to the formation of something called NOW, the National Organization for Women. NOW began to push for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment that had been sitting around Congress since 1923, and began to push for real equality and supported ending protective legislation, which of course, with that men and women were different. Republicans and business interests wanted the Equal Rights Amendment. They wanted it to end protections. The unions were against. This is one of these odd moments in which the left and the right essentially are switching positions. But that soon didn't matter at all, because Title VII would end state protective legislation. And the ERA passed overwhelmingly in Congress, in the House and the Senate. This was a moment when there was bipartisan agreement on almost everything having to do with women's rights. So the Equal Rights Amendment, keep this in mind, the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972 passes overwhelmingly. 30 states ratified, they needed 38 states. 30 states ratified it in its first year. In addition, so that's getting us up to the end of 1972, in January of 1973, a big surprise, the Supreme Court decides Roe v. Wade. Many other women's rights acts pass overwhelmingly. The women's movement was on a roll. But then, with something to attack, another side appears, the Stop ERA movement together with the pro-life movement. And these were begun, and also some portions of them had existed before, and they were invigorated. And the Equal Rights Amendment eventually dies. But women won a lot in the meantime, and I just want to show you just how many things that they won. Here are just a few. There was Title IX of the 1972 Education Act, because in the Civil Rights Act, the title that had to do with education did not have the word sex put in. Another title of a different act was passed that prohibits sex discrimination in all federally aided education programs. The EO Act was passed, the EPA was amended, it goes on and on. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in 1974. In 1975, the Supreme Court declares that women cannot be excluded from any juries under any circumstances. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act was passed, the Retirement Equity Act. The list goes on and on and on. So women won a lot. And to make more sense of this long and complicated history, I compiled what historians and legal scholars have determined were the most important moments in this history, and this includes legislation and judicial decisions, major events, turning points, prominent individuals, lots of different things. And I aggregated them to quinquennia and then graphed them here. And a very large fraction of them, 45%, occur in the brief 10-year period between 1963 and 1973. I put them in 4 categories because I thought it might matter, but it doesn't matter at all. Now, I think it's useful, it's always useful in our field of economics because the world is complicated. History is messy. So it's very important. This is where we are very strong as social scientists. We can step back and think about a simple framework to understand what's going on. So I think it's useful to think about the rise of women's rights, of the women's rights movement, and the reinvigoration of an anti-feminist movement in terms of a very simple framework. And underlying the framework is the notion that women are difficult to organize. They're everywhere. They're in every family, they're in every income class, they're in every religion and race, ethnicity, and I believe they're in every zip code. Maybe there's a zip code without women, I don't know. But they do not see, women do not see that much can be done about their circumstances until some organization appears. So assume that individuals adhere to only one of 2 principles. They adhere to equality or they adhere to traditions and differences. And assume that each individual has, in each period of time, only 1 unit of time to use for either leisure or working for whatever they believe in, working toward either equality or differences. Let's call the first group a group of feminists for whom equality with men is valued, and call the other one traditionalists for whom differences are valued. And I'll put their preferences on the same graph here, one going positive direction to the right and the other positive direction to the left. The 2 groups initially have what we might think of as latent demands that get expressed when an organization is formed. And so the equality PDF, I wrote here in blue, gives the distribution of the feminists by their demand for equality, determining whether each will give effort, their one little unit, to support an organization or to lie on the beach, okay? So each feminist has a desired value of E. Let's say we have one here that has a desired value of ERA, and the woman at ERA will give her time if E is less than ERA. Therefore, after the ERA is passed by Congress, which it was in 1972, feminists from E0 to ERA will no longer give their time to the organization, and it will appear to be more radical. Similarly, each traditionalist has a desired value of D and will work for differences when the level is below their desired level. This group was also difficult to organize, and as you saw before, doesn't matter. As you saw before, the women's rights was sort of on a roll. Yeah, it's something down there. It's okay. Women's rights was on a roll, and this other group was sort of not heard from until it also had an organization. And so, as I said, it will work for differences when the level, it'll come back, forget about it, is below their desired level. And this group, as I said, was also difficult to organize, but was energized by the passage of the ERA and formed the Stop ERA movement. The person, for example, at D1 here will work for differences as long as the current value is less than D1. And when it's greater, she won't. And that group as well will look more extreme. So what I want to do now is turn to what the nation's electorate thought. And I'll think about four groups. It's very simple. There are men, there are women, there are younger people, that's individuals under the age of 35, and I'll have older people. They're not too old, don't worry. They're 35 or over, so that gives us four groups. And I'll turn to what these groups thought in terms of women's roles and women's rights. And this all comes from data from Gallup, from the GSS, from the ANES. These are all public opinion polls. In some cases, the data go back to the 30s or the 40s, and others, they begin in the 70s. Interestingly, Gallup and other opinion pollsters didn't ask in the 60s, they didn't ask questions about women. They did before and they did after. It's sort of interesting that, at least in the US, they were very concerned with civil rights and not with women's rights. So some of these opinion poll questions are well known, and I'll provide a useful summary at the end, so you don't have to take all this in. I'll just provide a summary at the end because there are going to be a lot of different graphs giving the year when the median person in each of these four groups agreed with the question. The first four concerned women's competencies and role. And I begin with one that many people know, which is, should a married woman work for pay if her husband can support her? And the series begins, as you can see, very low. Interestingly, even though women had entered the labor force, and there was a lot of propaganda to do that, in World War II. So they begin very low. And then they get higher. So let me just move over here. And now I add the views of men. And note that there are no data, as I said, from 1945 to 1970, when the numbers become very substantial, especially for the younger group. Two details of this are striking. The first is how similar the answers are by sex, And the second is the large change that occurs sometime between 1945 and 1970. And we have other data that leads us to believe that the change probably occurred in the mid to late 1960s. A related question, and one that provides some clues to the previous one, and this is also a very well-known one, is whether a preschool child would suffer, and I love the use of the word suffer. We have no idea what that means, but they're suffering, if their mother works, okay? And even as late as in this question was actually begun to be asked in these surveys in 1977, even as late as 1977, 80% of this, quote, older group of men and almost 70% of the women believed that a child would suffer. The fraction is substantial even for those at that time who were younger. And even in the 2000s, it's still fairly substantial. The great divide in opinion about women's work concerns young children. It becomes much lower, as you can see, in the more recent period, but it's still substantial. Another informative question is whether the U.S. would be better governed if women were more politically active. Initial differences by sex, which are there, disappear by around 1970, and the vast majority of Americans agree that women should be more politically active. Of course, people like Marjorie Greene, we don't want to be politically active. Until her, I would have said all women should be more politically active, but she is really a Looney Tune. Okay. And finally, whether the individual would vote for a female president, and this was expressed brilliantly in the Gallup and the GSS, because it was, would you vote for a woman president if she was running in your party? Okay. So, because someone might have interpreted, well, if there's a woman running, she's not running in my party. So this question was asked many, many more times than the other questions for some reason. And we can see the great change that occurs in the 1960s. These 4 opinion poll questions that I have mentioned demonstrate that Americans thought that women could be employed, although maybe not with young children, that the country would be better governed with more women, and that a woman, in fact, could become president. The next 3 questions I'll mention concern whether women should be granted more equality. And we will see that even though Americans thought women were highly competent, they were less willing, both men and women were less willing to hand over the reins to them of government, business, corporate sector, whatever. The first question is, should women be granted an equal role in business, industry, and government? Of interest here is the somewhat higher fraction of women agreeing, but we should be struck by the generally low level of agreement until around the 1990s. And similarly, with regard to a person's warmth for the women's movement, which is a bit higher for women, but still the whole thing is pretty low. And finally, even more so, whether the person identified with being a feminist. And people had all sorts of bizarre definitions of what it meant to be a feminist. And part of that was due to the fact, as I said before, that the women's movement became more radical and looked more radical than the entire group of women who really believed in feminism and in the tenets of the women's movement. So, given the time, I want to summarize the material with a visual just to give you a sense of how this looks, and then sum up and give you one additional thing. So I want to summarize with a visual, and usually we have little dots, but I thought it would be easier if, since I have 4 groups, I have 2 colors. Women will be orange and men will be blue. The older group will be chickens and the younger group will be chicks. And this is how it works. So they will move out, and where they land is the year, see, that the year in which the median older man, meaning over the age of 35, not too old, so about 1957 or so is where the median believed in, would vote for a female president. And then we have the younger man, and then we have the younger woman, and then we have the older woman, okay? And so these give us the date, and you can see that, as I said before, it's pretty early in this history when the median person in each of these 4 groups agreed with that statement. So let's put in the others. For the opinions concerning what women are capable of, you can see each group has a majority that agrees with the statement fairly early in this history, and the differences by sex, by and large, are not that great, which is the conclusion we came to before. In contrast, the year the majority of Americans, it'll come back, the year the majority of Americans agree to give women more rights is much later. Similarly, for the year they agreed with the principles of major women's rights groups and with their chief tenet, feminism, which, as you can see from the top thing, never exceeds 50% in all of the public opinion polls we've looked at. But what this does not show are the divisions that were revealed within women, which I've been referring to throughout, which returns us to the history and to the little toy model that I began with. Recall that the toy model showed that as a group unifies, it will gain rights, but in addition, as it gains those rights, it will begin to appear more radical or more extreme, and it will then reinvigorate the other side and sort of go back and forth. So what I want to do as the last point I want to make is to examine 2 of the questions that we just looked at, but rather than examining them for the whole period, what I would like to do is examine these in more detail to see differences within women and within men. So what we couldn't see in the graphs is that women were greatly divided. For example, on the question of equal rights, which is given here on the left side, if you look at the means on the question of equal role, if you look at the means across all years here, from 1972 to 2008, about 47% on average of women agreed with that, and about 44% of men did. But only 31% of traditional women agreed, where traditional, here I'm defining it as a group of women who have less than a college degree, are older, are married, and are not employed. But in fact, 72%, that's much higher, of the non-traditional women, which is just the opposite description of that. They're college graduates, they're younger, they're not married, they are employed, agreed. And that's a difference of 41 percentage points, whereas the initial difference was, that's a difference of 41 percentage points. For the men, the difference is 19 percentage points. So whereas the initial difference between men and women was just 3 percentage points, there's a much larger difference here between men and women, but more importantly, the difference is large within women, is really what I would like to say. Similarly, for the women's movement question, which exists from 1970 to 2000, the difference between all men and all women was just 7 percentage points, but that between traditional and non-traditional women was 38 percentage points, whereas the same thing between traditional men and non-traditional men, as I'm defining it here, we can define it other ways, is just 17 percentage points. The point is pretty clear throughout this history that eventually within women, two groups appear. So let me sum up this very complex history. In 1960, few recognized that there was discrimination with regard to sex. But with the 1960 election, women had become a political force, and women began to adopt the term oppression from the civil rights movement. But the civil rights movement did a lot more for women. It fortuitously and almost accidentally gave women Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it also gave them the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that enforces Title VII. And that led, though, through a more contentious period, to the formation of the National Organization for Women. With the end of protective legislation, it also led to the passage, almost unanimously in Congress, of the Equal Rights Amendment, and to a huge list of women's rights gains, in part due to the women's electorate clout after 1960. The Supreme Court then delivered the surprise gift in January of '73 that was recently reversed. These gains also led to more radical women's movement and to the rise of an anti-feminist, pro-family, anti-state aid, and anti-abortion organization, several organizations. It produced more polarization among women than among men. But even though it is hard to show convincingly that rights led to change, it is also hard to believe that the well-being of most women did not improve because of the expansion of these rights, and it is likely that the actions of the traditionalists have diminished the ability of women to fully use these rights. For example, the ability of women to have funding for universal pre-K and parental leave in the US. But it is also hard to believe that we would all be in this room today and that I would be standing before you had our rights remained as they were in 1962. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Claudia, for a wonderful presentation. We are now opening the floor for questions from the audience, both here and online. So, important for online audience, short questions, please, and include your name and affiliation. And for those here, please raise your hand, and we will pass you a microphone so you can ask your question. I mean, just to break the ice, and actually I'm picking up on one question from the audience. Yuki, who is a student from the LSE, prompts the obvious question from actually some of your last words, which is, how does the reversal of Roe v. Wade fit in this story? How do you interpret it? Is this about the backlash
How does Dobbs, you mean?
How does it fit in the story, in the overall evolution of women's rights?
Well, how it actually fits is something we have to see, and I don't predict the future. I only predict the past. But of course, remember that even when Roe was passed, there were many states that had changed their abortion laws, and so America has a federal system, and so states can do what they want. Often, I mean, what Roe did was what Brown did in civil rights. So the NAACP was expending resources, state after state, to get equality between blacks and whites, and to get more resources for black children, because the decision that was standing was the one that said that you could have separate and it could be equal. And the NAACP said, well, if that's the case, make it equal, okay? And they went around, did that, but that was very expensive. So that's the point, that it's much better for those who would like to have abortion be allowed to have it as a federal law. It's much better that we don't have a federal law that says abortion is banned, because each state can do what they want.
So I have one question here, one question there, one question here. Let's say three.
I'll stand up. My name is Marijana. I came from Croatia, from Zagreb, and I'm running a small NGO trying to fight, let's say, for gender equity for the last 7-8 years. And the thing that is really bothering me, and having said the answer to the question previously, is definitely that the moment we lose focus, we regress when it comes to every kind of civil rights, especially women's rights. And what is your, let's say, advice, recommendation, how to address?
Yeah, I forgot to say there are two things I never do. I don't predict the future, and I don't give advice.
But you definitely have some kind of, let's say, attitude towards it, because we are all aware of it, and even the graphs that you show us show that the problem is also within the female population, and it's still there. So
right.
we take the things for granted, that's a huge
right.
jeopardy. So
yeah.
Thank you.
But it is also said, and I think that this is the case, that that a group that would like a set of rights and would like certain things can't lose sight of the fact that society is heterogeneous, and heterogeneous in very deeply felt beliefs, okay? And so therefore one of the errors that I think some of the radical sections of the women's rights movement made in the 70s and in the 60s was to lose sight of the fact that there were individuals who have felt demeaned by the group, and that's the last thing you want to do. You want to win them over as well. So.
Yeah, there. Yes, sorry.
Thank you so much. My name is Helena. I'm a master's student here at LSE. You really drew a wonderful picture of how far women have come, but you're also the first female solo economist to win the Nobel Prize in economics. So what will it take for economics to also see that women can win?
And this is a wonderful question, and the answer is very, very simple. It's called time. And let me tell you why I know it's going to be a tiny amount of time. When I became the president of the American Economic Association, I could look back and I could see that there were, Ann Krieger was, and Rivlin, and it was like I'd have to go back 15 years and 12 years, and I was president, and then suddenly there are, just look at the list, there are 5 or 6 amazing female economists who've become president of the American Economic Association, okay, including Susan Ethy and Janet Curry and Christy Romer, and I have, so it's a matter of time.
I'm Valeria Terrones. Thank you for this amazing presentation. I'm from Sussex University. I'm PhD student in economics. So my question is about what kind of incentives can give the universities and the society also to increase the number of PhD students in the field?
I think you asked what type of incentives can be given to increase the number of women who study economics. PhD, right. Well, that's sort of interesting because it's you can't say, for example, how can I increase the number of women who are 20 years old unless I increase the number of women who are 15? And that was exactly the reason why I started something called the Undergraduate Women in Economics program. And I can explain what I think was going on because we know that, well, it's not impossible to make astrophysicists into economists or mathematicians into economists, but mainly we're drawing from undergraduate economics programs into PhD programs. And so if we don't have women who are majoring in economics or who are taking enough economics, we're not going to be able to have women who are PhDs. So that's why I started that. It was pretty clear that what was going on was women think, okay, let me step back and say, it's our fault. We are doing something wrong. We are giving a sense to undergraduates that economics is not about people. And the psychologists and the sociologists are really excited about that. They say, oh, yeah, you want people? We got people. They don't got people. They got markets. They've got numbers. They've got alphas and betas, So we have to do a much, much better job telling young people that economics is about people. It's about inequality. It's about development. It's about health. It's about everything. We are imperialistic, and we should be imperialistic in the sense that we are about everything. We're about people. Now, here's the bad news. So we did that, and it worked pretty well, except for the fact that what we discovered was that before students even stepped in on campus, women had decided that they didn't want to major in economics, and men had decided that they did, because the men think that economics is about finance, and the women think economics is about finance. So the men are majoring in economics for the wrong reasons, and the women are not majoring in economics for the wrong reasons. So we have to go back to the high schools. That's what we have to do.
Claudia, looking at the chat, I mean, there is a question about a specific type of feminist, which is religious traditionalist feminist. I'm not going to press you too much on that particular group, unless you want to specifically speak about that. But maybe revisit this question of feminism and different types of feminisms.
Right.
One thing that struck me in your presentation is that you draw this dichotomy, which I'm sure is a simplification, about wanting equality and wanting diversity, but I am aware of...
Difference, not diversity.
Sorry, difference. But I am aware of feminist, traditional feminist thought that stresses difference and at the same time wants equality. So can you help about that?
Yeah, I am defining feminism in a very, very simple way. And Laurel Ulrich said this a long time ago. And in fact, there were bumper stickers that said this with her name. Laurel Ulrich is a famous historian. And it was very simple. She said, feminism is the simple notion that women are equal to men. It's that simple, okay? I really do not think that there is any other definition of it.
More, actually,
In fact, one of the things that, as an American, I feel strongly about is that if you replace the word woman with the word black, you will see that, and men with the word white, no one would say that equality is, in terms of racial equality, is not the fact that these are equal human beings. Why is not that the case for men and women?
Thank you. We're moving upstairs.
We're moving upstairs? Hello, upstairs. I'm sorry I have not paid any attention to you. I really didn't even see you up there. It's my fault. I was paying attention to this silly screen.
Thank you. Thank you for acknowledging us upstairs.
Yeah.
We're not worthy.
Well, I mean, there are things in the heavens I don't see either.
Yeah, and thank you for that analogy, yes. Sorry, my name's Dr. Zubaida Haque. I'm the Deputy Director of the leading national feminist economics think tank in this country. I'm also the former chief exec of a race equality think tank in this country, so I'm really pleased that you covered the intersectional elements of women's rights and race discrimination. My question is related to actually what's going on at the moment, which is elections, and what's coming up this year, general elections in this country. And something that Women's Budget Group did with the Race Equality Think Tank in 2018, which is we looked at the distributional, intersectional impact of all the government's economic decisions from 2010 to 2020. And we asked the question, how did it affect men and how did it affect women? And I'm sure this answer won't surprise you, which is, of course, women fared worse than men. Black and ethnic minority people, women, fared worse than white women. And the worst group, the most affected group by tax and benefit cuts by this government since 2010 were black women in single lone parent households. Now, the reason I ask you that question is we've never had a female Chancellor of the Exchequer. It may change this year. The Labour government have a shadow female Chancellor of the Exchequer. So the question to you is this. Broadly speaking, what three things would you say to the next government that they should do with their economic decisions that would benefit women equally?
Okay. I'm going to answer that question, but you must realize that you have just broken two of the things that I said I would not do. Both of them at the same time.
I'm in the heavens, I hope.
That's right. I don't tell people what to do, and I don't predict the future. However, I do know, and I don't know very much about what's going on in this country and in your government, but I do know that, and this is something that I was thinking about before, that we inherit the past. We inherit the past in terms of this building, for example. We can build the Marshall Building and have the building that we want, but we then take these buildings and we cobble things together, and that's what we do with society. And so we have the major impediment is the fact that that there are care responsibilities throughout the age distribution, throughout the society, and women do the volunteer care work. They also do the paid care work, but they also disproportionately do the volunteer care work. And that some of that care work is done by institutions that were put together, cobbled together in the same way this building was. We need a Marshall building for this care work. We need to get rid of the fact that school ends at 2:30 in the afternoon and that it begins when children are 6 years old, and that the elderly, in my country at least, are not often taken care of at home. It's expensive. They have to go to a hospital. And all of these things don't have a purpose today. They had a purpose yesterday and the week before. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Let's see some, person up there.
Thank you
Person
so
up
much,
there.
Professor, for the talk. I'm just an LSE student, but you covered the differences between younger women and older women and younger men and older men in a worldview or view in this topic specifically. But we covered it in so many years, right? So I got lost in the transition between being a younger woman to an older woman and a younger man to an older man, and how this affects the views of one person becoming older. So my question to you is, are people getting older becoming more traditional in general? Is that a trend that we see in history? And if this is the case, why and how can we stop maybe people that I get... I mean, if it is our aim, people becoming more traditional when they're becoming older.
Yeah, this is an excellent question, and one of the problems in the social sciences is trying to pull apart cohort effects from year effects. That's really what you're asking, from age effects, and of course they're linear, so there are difficulties. But do individuals become more traditional? I mean. In much of this work, of course, you can't pull this apart that easily. I'm not certain that individuals become more traditional. I mean, this is a much bigger question than what I'm dealing with here. It's that they have more at stake. They have that thing called a home, and they have property, and they have wealth. And therefore, they often become more conservative, I would say, rather than, I would use the word conservative here rather than traditional, yeah. And I agree with you, it'd be very, very nice if we could stop time and we could all just, be 22 again. Although I don't think I want to go back to the March on the Pentagon.
Thank you. We have a question down here.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really insightful. Do you believe that with the two options you put on the screen, with option one on how we would look to, have an equal pay and equal, productivity for workers, do you think, as statistically, that women live for longer? That if we incentivize them by giving them higher pay, that they'll be able to kind of teach the younger generation and end up being more productive for the economy in the long term?
The question is, if I give women more pay, they will be more productive? No,
as in, do you think they can also teach, the whole... I can't explain it, I'm trying to say, can they be the spearheads of the new economy as we continue to build goods?
If women can.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say yes because I'm not quite certain how to answer it.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Up there, the back.
Hello, Professor Goldin. First of all, thank you so much for this talk. My name is Teodora Margaritova, and I'm a master's student here at the LSE in political economy. So my question regards one of the graphs that you showed us, which seems to suggest that currently, across the population, there is vast agreement in the fact that the political participation of women is of importance for reaching optimal goals. However, there seems to be a big paradox in the sense that when you go to parliament, you don't really see an equal number of men and women being represented there. And even worse, a lot of the women represented there tend to be exactly as you defined, the so-called traditional women that don't really advocate feminist values. So my question is, how would you explain this discrepancy and this type of phenomenon? And would you say that if we in some way bridge the gap between traditional and feminist women, that we can get towards like better representation of women politically?
Yeah, so interesting. So you used the word parliament, and we don't have a parliament. We have this thing called a Congress. So if you were referring to actual parliament, I don't have a good answer for that. But for the U.S., for Congress, you should read the histories of women in Congress for in the 1970s and the 1980s, and they were not traditional and conservative women at all. They were incredibly active women. Okay, in the forefront would be someone like Bella Abzug, Elizabeth Holzman. I mean, the list goes on and on. So,
I think we have time for one last question. Okay, yeah, well, given the intensity, I can't,
So my name is Eliza, and I work at Brunel University, and I'm here with my friend from Poland, and we do research on unpaid care labor.
Yeah.
So my first question, because there were two of us, would be, what are your ideas on how to include unpaid care labor into official statistics, and any ideas for how to compensate for it? And the second question, if I may?
Sure.
Just briefly, because we come from Poland, and we've been wondering how to convince traditional women or more traditional parts of society that equality is actually important. So what would be your approach here?
So these are important issues in economics, which is which goes back, and nobody wants to hear all about this, to how we formed national income accounting in the first place. Okay, no one wants to hear about this. But it is interesting, and that's exactly this point, which is, so this goes back to my intellectual grandfather, who is Simon Kuznets. And it is simply just extremely messy and difficult to add in unpaid work, because there are many other things as well that we would like to add in, such as what do we do about pollution, and what do we do about leisure, and so on and so forth. However, that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. And I think that the way to think about this has to do with the answer that I gave to the previous question. I also do not think that paying individuals who are doing unpaid work, having the government pay them, is going to lead to the correct solution to what we think the problem is. But I think this is extremely important. What we do about traditional people in society is, in some sense, not to demean what they do, and to be uplifting. And we can see in the U.S., for example, in many countries, that as the levels of education rise, and as a sense in the part of these individuals that they can have both worlds of career and family, that this, in some sense, will take care of itself. There are traditional people who are traditional, not in terms of social norms, but in terms of their own belief systems. And for that, that's their doing.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to say thank you again to Claudia. There is another lecture straight after this one, so
yeah, and I want to stay for it.
please.
But
can
they're
I
not gonna
ask
let
you
me.
to vacate the theater promptly, even if you have tickets for the next lecture, I still need to ask you to please get out and then come in again. And then before that, please.